Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Tuesday, February the 11th, 2025, and today we're going to talk about growing awesome spring lettuce, and we'll get a question about managing excessive phosphorus. That's a mouthful, so let's do it. All right, well, welcome to Tuesday, everyone. We are in the middle of a winter storm here named Harlow, which is a great name. So at least that part is fun. Who knows if I will have power to post this later. Anyways, always an adventure. But I managed to get the ginger started yesterday, which is just putting ginger in a tray covered with soil mix or peat moss. In this case, it was soil mix, and then placing that in a warm place. And we got the first round of my potato sprouting experiments going. I've talked about that a couple times. What will be fun about this particular experiment is that I'm using potatoes that I did this with last year. So maybe I can develop a potato that sprouts and grows higher quality, higher yielding potatoes from sprouts instead of potato cuttings. Anyway, more on that later. We also had a sick kid yesterday, so that was basically the day, as any parent will tell you. Also, I want to give a quick shout out to my buddy Philip in Norfolk, England, who clearly anticipating the storm sent me this awesome Brighton and Hove Albion beanie to keep me warm. So big shouts to that, and big shouts to all of my friends across the pond. Also, while we're shouting, big shouts to the majority of the commenters yesterday for being fair and respectful in your comments, and not just to me, but to other commenters. Not all of you achieved that, bless your hearts, but I remain proud of my comment section. I thought you all have been largely thoughtful in your responses, which is not a surprise. So shouts to that. Anyway, today we are going to talk about the opposite of anything political and master early spring head lettuce and lettuce mix. I mean, I guess you could make that political. Let's not. So we'll talk about starting lettuce from seeds in the first segment, then move to the planting in the third segment. First, as far as crops go, lettuce is just straight up built for the spring and the slow ease into the heat. It will not generally bolt, that is to say, go to seed, just because it was exposed to a cold snap in the way that, for example, biennials often do. What I mean is that crops such as celery or carrots or kale or whatever, which are called biennials, will bolt in the spring if they endure too long of a cold snap after planting because they think they've survived a winter. Lettuce, not so much, or at least not generally. So that means that spring is not only an easier time to grow lettuce, it's kind of the prime time to grow lettuce until the fall. And so taking advantage of that is essential and fun. I mean, when you're always pushing the seasons, as you often are doing in market gardening, it's kind of nice and satisfying to grow something that actually wants to be growing when you're growing it. Yeah. For varieties, you pretty much have your pick of the litter here with lettuce. Even the more heat-tolerant varieties will do well in the cooler weather. Just because they can put up with the heat doesn't mean they sit around hoping for heat. The varieties that I've been growing most over the last few years are Blue Rock for romaine, Cherokee for red romaine, Muir for leaf lettuce, and Salanova for mixed lettuce. Salanova is stupidly expensive, so I also mix Muir, M-U-I-R, into the Salanova to reduce that cost a little bit. And then we just cut them just above that core to make sure that we can get new growth on it and multiple cuttings, especially in the spring. But anyway, that just brings that cost down a little bit. Just make sure if you do that to buy the pelleted Muir and not the naked Muir, naked meaning not pelleted, although I don't think they call it naked. I think they just call it pelleted or just seed. Anyway, in fact, because I have our kids often help me in exchange for Legos, I use exclusively pelleted seeds. These have a little clay coating that makes them, the smaller seeds, bigger and round. Non-pelleted lettuce seeds are cruel, and we use those only for direct seeding into the soil for baby lettuce mix. We like the All-Star lettuce mix from Johnny's is the one we usually go with. Mostly, though, for starts, we use the pelleted lettuce. Also, fun fact, if someone ever gives you non-pelleted celery seed, it's a subtle declaration of war, so just like a heads up there. Anyway, the leaves of Muir are a little bit big, but it gets the best second cutting, even in the summer, of all of my lettuce mixes, so I liked having that in there just in general. No matter what varieties you use, as you inch closer to the spring, start using more heat-tolerant varieties, because lettuce started in late April is a June harvest, and if June can be hot where you are, like it can be here, then you'll need lettuce that can take a little bit of heat. We start our lettuce in 200 block soil blocks from Swift Blocker, talked about it before, which are the pretty tiny ones at roughly 0.9 inches squared. If I was using cell trays, I would use the 128 size cells, which is closer to 1 inch by 1 inch. Really, you can use that size or bigger. Just depends on the space you have and the amount of soil mix you want to use. For seeding, make a shallow dibble in the middle with your fingers, or a dibbler if you're using cell trays. The dibble will already be there for most soil blockers, so that's not really an issue. Shallow is the key word here. Lettuce is not a deep germinator, and shallow is also a key word when it comes to covering the lettuce. If you're using something like vermiculite to cover the seeds, you can get away with a little deeper of a layer on top of the seeds. But if you're using soil mix like I do, a very light covering will do the job. They almost do not need to be covered at all. So if you can still see the seeds a little under the mix, you're fine. I've seen people pile way too much mix on top of the soil, on top of the seeds, and get almost zero germination. So don't do that. The covering is barely necessary. You just need to give the germs something to grab onto and to hold on to the moisture enough for the seeds to germinate. Lettuce can germinate at relatively cold temperatures, starting in around the 40 to 50 degree range, which would be like 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, but really peaking in the high 60s Fahrenheit or around 20 degrees Celsius. Then they will still germ okay up until around the mid 80s, at which point the seeds go into what we call thermodormancy, meaning they ain't germinating for you until things cool down. They're dormant. The colder the temperature, the slower the germination, like it takes longer. But lettuce at the ideal temperature will take roughly 3 days. Now, we will talk about summer lettuce at a later date, and I've already done a few lettuce videos that I will link in the show notes if you're interested. Once the seeds germinate, they need to be moved into a good amount of light or they will get leggy fast, meaning they grow tall and thin, and they need to be kept moist until they're ready to plant. To try to keep them at around 70 to 75 degree range or 20 to 22 degrees Celsius and well watered throughout their adolescence. You could technically plant the blocks or cells or whatever anytime after they are germinated, but ideally you wait until the soil has warmed up a bit and you're past your last chance of freeze. Like you don't want to put small plants out there and then they freeze. Lettuce is pretty hardy, but it is not a miracle worker. In fact, that's kind of the value of starting them in a greenhouse or perhaps under grow lights or something, is that you can grow them to a reasonable size while you wait for the conditions outside to improve. Anyway, we'll talk about planting and also sowing directly into the soil in the third segment. But first, let's take a break for phosphorus. I mean, it is Tuesday after all. Probably relevant. BRB.
Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Farmhand. I don't know about you, but I got into farming to be in the field growing food for my community, not creating elaborate pack lists, not writing newsletters or responding to emails, not designing and maintaining web stores, and etc. And I especially don't enjoy doing those things after an already full and fulfilling day of growing food. Actually, if I spent less time on my phone and behind the computer, that would be great. If only there were a solution for that. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for farmers. With one single platform, Farmhand enables you to offload your administrative tasks, send and manage communications, and sell more to your customers. Farmhand saves growers an average of 6 hours of administrative load each week. That's 6 hours so you can get back into the field, spend more time with friends or family, or have a life outside of the farm, which is actually a thing. Think about it. What would you do with an extra 6 hours a week? Sign up for a free trial with the link in the show notes, because now is the best time to dial in those systems for the next growing season. Follow the Farmhand link in the show notes to learn more. All right, back to the show.
If you, the listener, are enjoying this content, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere the questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions. Now, today's Patreon question comes from Patreon member Blair Aiken, who writes, quote, "Hi, Jesse. I'm slightly obsessed with your daily podcast. Really appreciate all your hard work to make the info we want and need accessible and enjoyable to listen to. Thanks, Blair. My question is on soil test results. This last fall, we tested just about every area on our farm, beds we've babied with amendments and compost, beds we've done nothing to for years, and new beds we converted from lawn. Every one of them has come back with nitrogen on the floor and phosphorus through the roof. We are particularly stumped by the phosphorus. Any ideas on why phosphorus would be so high and how to lower it? Thanks for all you do." End quote. Okay, so thanks, Blair. Great questions. I am a little fascinated by the fact that the phosphorus is through the roof, no matter how you treated those beds. However, that does lead me to assume that you have used the same or roughly the same type of compost on those beds, and that compost is likely manure-based. or possibly you have just had manure or somebody before you did. Manure-based composts tend to be very high in phosphorus compared to plant-based compost, and the amount of phosphorus and the availability of it differ a little bit. In other words, the base material used to make the compost can have a significant impact on the amount of phosphorus and among other nutrients the compost contains. So to your issue with nitrogen on the floor, as you called it, meaning to the listener the nitrogen levels are very low, perhaps exploring nitrogenous options that are not compost and do not contain much or preferably any phosphorus is one option for balancing those numbers out a bit. This also depends on the types of nitrogen present in the soil, but that's perhaps for another show. In terms of organic nitrogenous amendments, beyond leguminous cover crops, which are my preference generally, but are not easy for every grower in every situation, there are various blood meals and feather meals that contain high nitrogen but low or no phosphorus. And then things like cottonseed meal and soybean meal, among others, that are low in phosphorus but high in not being from animals. Now, I'm not an agronomist, and so any amending that you do to the soil should really be run through a trained agronomist. So I'm just giving you some of the things to think about, but honestly, consult with an agronomist before you do any of these things. My understanding is that phosphorus is generally not a very mobile element, meaning the risks of it leaching in water are low from compost because it binds so well to the organic matter, which may somewhat explain why it's still there in places that you haven't done anything to for a long time. I'll even link an excellent article on the subject from Biocycle. That said, phosphorus can move on soil particles pretty easily, so erosion can lead to phosphorus pollution, but that also means it stays put pretty well unless you remediate the phosphorus, meaning you take it out of the soil with something. The perhaps easiest way to do that is by growing grain crops in those areas or growing cover crops and removing the plant material at termination. What isn't really well studied yet in terms of compost applications is how excessive phosphorus levels affect yield and how those numbers change over time. We're getting more research, as I've discussed in previous episodes, but more research is definitely needed, especially long-term research. Of course, not to poke the bear or anything, research is also on the chopping block for funding, so we'll see. On our farm, we have a variety of different systems going, but in the areas where we have applied large applications of compost, we do also have high phosphorus levels, and so we've also pulled back on those applications of compost. Basically, we get the beds mulched with compost generally to start those beds, and then we just apply compost or amendments as needed. Hopefully that will help our farm to reduce our phosphorus or at least not add to it. Anyway, I hope that's helpful or somewhat insightful, maybe both, maybe neither. I try to have a little of everything. Soil chemistry is complicated. It's a complicated subject that deals not only with what you add, but soil type, climate, temperatures, moisture levels, and more. So whether or not the excessive phosphorus will be a problem for you can be hard to tell. Listeners, feel free to add your 2 cents. Otherwise, it's one more quick break, and then we'll finish out the lettuce. Be right back. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by GrowSmart. Curious if your soil will be ready for planting this spring? GrowSmart can help you find out with their at-home soil tests. They'll ship it right to your door. Just send it back with your prepaid shipping and you'll have your lab results in just 2 business days. Their reports are simple with tailored seasonal recommendations for fertilizers and amendments. Order now at growsmart.com and use the code DAILY for 10% off. That's DAILY. Begin your soil prep now for a great spring with GrowSmart. All right, back to the show. All right, so we're going to continue on lettuce for the third part of the show, and I'm going to talk a bit about sowing directly into a bed first, which is really not hard, and a lot of the earlier information about temperatures and how deep you plant it and all that stuff still applies. First, although lettuce will germinate well before most weeds will that aren't chickweed or purple nettle, or those sort of cold season weeds, do not sow lettuce into a bed. You suspect spring weeds will be a problem because you still want to get multiple cuttings from your earliest plantings. And if you get one good cutting and then the weeds pop through on the second one, that's not great. Truthfully, get weed management under control as best you can before relying on direct seeded crops in general. A light compost mulch can help. But if you suspect problems, consider transplanting heads first. The soil doesn't need a ton in terms of amending because lettuce is a light feeder. A small amount of nutritional compost or a very small amount of fertilizing compost or maybe some alfalfa meal or something is more than enough if necessary at all. Weeds and compaction and poor drainage are all going to be a bigger issue than fertilizing for most lettuce crops. Ditto most crops, really. For sowing lettuce directly into the soil, again, not too deep is the key, but it also has to stay sufficiently moist. The soil does, and the seeds, which can be difficult sometimes in deep compost mulches. So you may need to figure out a proper irrigation option for making sure that whatever you sow into the deep compost mulch gets moisture enough. I also recommend throwing a row cover over top just to hold that humidity in there. I didn't say this in the first segment, though I've said it in earlier episodes. My first lettuce, I start in mid-January to be transplanted in the tunnels in late February. I will also sow lettuce directly into the beds in the tunnels in late January using our Jang seeder, but I actually like the Earthway for naked, non-pelleted lettuce seed as well. Either of those work fine. For my first field plantings here in Kentucky, Zone 6B, I start those in early February for early March transplants, giving myself 4 to 5 weeks if need be to germinate and grow them out. Anyway, I grow them until the leaves fully cover the block, but again, you can transplant them later or earlier. Later when they start to crowd the block, and you risk more transplant shock earlier, and you risk them just drying out or dying or from a lack of adequate root system, and also the blocks will fall apart easily if the roots haven't kind of taken them over. When they're too small. Anyway, full block coverage is a reasonable rule to follow. Like when it's just kind of when you can't see any more soil, you're usually good to go. Then if you're using cells, I would recommend hardening them off for a couple days in direct sunlight before transplanting. Basically, you just set them out on a table in direct sunlight and let them kind of harden up a little bit. If using soil blocks is not as necessary, I find you could probably get away more with not hardening lettuce off more in the spring than you can in the summer, either way. So that's up to you and your space. I transplant our lettuce at roughly 7.75 inches apart on a grid. That's roughly 20 centimeters on a grid using the 4x4 gridder from Neversink Farm Tools. I will link that tool in the show notes, but it's just a large metal spool that you roll down the middle of a bed and it marks your spacing for you. It's very efficient. It's much more efficient than what we used before, which was just like a rake with the row markers on it. Being that we're on 48-inch beds, 122 centimeters, we just have to eye the outer 2 rows because we don't have like a 48-inch bed gridder, which is fine. I mean, the outer rows sometimes get a little wonky, but generally it works out. I do think, though, that spacing is essential in terms of efficient cultivation. If stuff is inconsistently spaced, then cultivating becomes a bigger chore than it already is. So making sure that you do have a good, consistent grid of some sort is important. Then I transplant the lettuce, and in early spring, I cover it with R30 row cover to protect it from the cold with the row cover suspended by small hoops made of 9-gauge wire. The idea is to keep it the row cover from touching the leaves where it can cause damage when it gets frosted. We absolutely take the row cover off, though, on hot days or otherwise risk suffocating the plants and causing bolting. As for the spacing on the direct seeded crops, I usually just try and fit as many rows on a bed as I can. Basically just using the wheel spacing to determine where the next row goes. Anyway, more on the harvesting and storing part and selling part and all those parts of lettuce as the season rolls on, because it is an enormously important crop to us on our farm. So I will probably talk about it a lot more, but I think I'm going to wrap it up there. Before we go, though, I want to give a quick shout out to the good folks over there at Rimmel Greenhouses for making this show possible. So whether you're growing tomatoes for market, flowers in the spring, or vegetables for your family, growing in a high tunnel protected from the weather provides the right environment for a harvest you can count on. Rimmel Greenhouses are strong, durable, and easy to assemble, offering the quality you need to grow productively year-round. The team of experts at Rimmel Greenhouse Systems will be your trusted partners to ensure you get exceptional value from your greenhouse or high tunnel investment. Visit Rimmel.com today to get growing. Big thanks to all of our show sponsors. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and the team at No-Till Growers. Shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music you're hearing. Probably. Pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook or the Seed Farmer at no-tillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or you sign up in the month of February, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Anna Stoika. That's a fun name. And Josh Edmiston. Ooh, that's a tricky one, Josh. This is the story of a pair of linguists who travel to, let's say, West Virginia into the mountains to study there's this one town that has this really particular accent, has a unique cadence and delivery. But what this duo finds is that they're trying to investigate, like, why is this such a unique accent? Because it doesn't necessarily sound like your typical West Virginia accent. And what they find is that there was this movie that came out in the 50s and kind of got to the town, and they made a tradition out of watching it every Friday night. So every Friday night, the town kind of gets together and has like this big potluck and watches the movie, but it's been that way for like 70 years. And so this really like an interesting accent kind of unraveled from that, because a lot of people mimicked the movie and talked like the movie. But the weird thing is they don't really know where this movie came from. And so a big part of this novel is them trying to unravel the mystery of it. And it's quite the mystery. Anyway, thanks for watching and or listening. We will see you tomorrow. Yeah, bye.